Hello guys, welcome to Simp Recap channel. Today we are going to recapping a new movie. In the year 10,191, humans can travel to different planets and explore the universe. Each planet is like its own country, with leaders called dukes, but they're all part of one big empire. There's a special planet called Arrakis, covered in a tough desert, and it's the only place where a valuable substance called spice can be found. This spice is important because it helps people stay healthy and allows them to travel between planets. So, even though Arrakis is a tough place to live, all the noble families want to control it because of the spice. On the planet Arrakis, there are outsiders who come to collect spice at night to avoid the daytime heat. These outsiders have treated the local people very badly because they want the spice. The Harkonnen family arrived on the planet a long time ago and now controls the spice production, making them even richer than the Emperor. The local people, called the Freemen, often try to fight the spice collectors to make them leave, but they are never strong enough to win. Then, one day, the Emperor orders the Harkonnens and their group to leave the planet. But nobody knows why. Meanwhile, in Caladan, Lady Jessica and her son, Paul of House Atreides, are having breakfast. Jessica wants her son to practice a power known as Bene Gesserit and tells him to use the voice, which should allow him to mind control people. Paul tries to use it on her and fails, but Jessica reminds him it takes years to learn. She also asks if he's had any dreams, and Paul thinks about the visions of a girl called Chani, but he lies and says no. After his meal, Paul learns more about Arrakis, which is plagued by powerful sandstorms and giant sandworms. The Freemen, who live on Arrakis, have blue eyes because they've been around spice for a long time, and they see it as something very important. The Emperor, known as Emperor, uses spice to help his spaceship navigators travel in space. Later, Paul and his dad, Duke Leto, meet a messenger from the Emperor who brings important news. Their family, House Atreides, is going to take control of Arrakis and look after it. Duke Leto agrees and seals the deal by using his ring. After the meeting, Paul talks to Duncan, the swordmaster of House Atreides. Paul wants to go to Arrakis with Duncan and his team, but Duncan can't because he'd get in trouble for it. Paul tells Duncan about the premonitory dreams he's had of Arrakis, explaining he's seen Duncan with the Freemen and dying in battle. However, Duncan still says no because he doesn't believe in the dreams. Refusing to give up, Paul goes to see Leto to ask for permission to go with Duncan, but Leto also refuses because Paul must be at his side when the family arrives in Arrakis. He fears a war is coming, that's why he sent Duncan ahead with a team to try to forge an alliance with the Freemen. Later, Paul trains at sword fighting with Gurney, the War Master of House Atreides, who is angry because Paul doesn't take training seriously and forces him into combat. While using a force field shield to prevent the blades from penetrating, they fight for a few minutes and end in a tie, which would have been a mutual death without the shields. Gurney warns him how vicious the Harkonnens are, so Paul should be ready for war. Meanwhile in Gadi Prime, the homeworld of House Harkonnen, Robin visits his uncle Baron Harkonnen to tell him that all of their ships have left Arrakis. Furious, he yells as he wonders why the Emperor did this to them. But the Baron and his right-hand man, Peter, say something mysterious about gifts not always being true gifts. Meanwhile, in Caladan, Jessica wakes up Paul in the middle of the night because Reverend Mother Gaius from the Bene Gesserit school is visiting and wants to talk to Paul. Jessica had told her about Paul's dreams. First, Dr. Yu checks Paul's health, and he quietly tells Paul that the Bene Gesserit, while claiming to do good, also have their own agenda. Yu also says that Paul's heart is healthy. Jessica uses sign language to ask him to keep this secret. They are on their way to meet the Reverend Mother. Jessica signals Paul to remember his training using sign language. When they enter the room, Reverend Mother Gaius tells Jessica to wait outside, and she instructs Paul to obey Gaius. Paul gets upset that Gaius gave his mom an order, but she uses a special power to make him kneel. Then, Gaius tells Paul to put his hand in a box while she holds a poison needle near his neck. If he takes his hand out before she says she'll use the needle, Paul starts to feel intense pain, but Jessica recites something to help him deal with it. He starts seeing his visions of the desert and keeps his head up. Paul passes the test and is allowed to take out his hand, which is uninjured. Gaius tells him that if he had been unable to resist his impulses, like an animal, she would have had to kill him because he has inherited too much power from his mother. Then she asks him about his dreams, so Paul tells her about the girl in the desert afterward. Gaius leaves, but on her way out, Gaius reminds Jessica that to train a man for the Bene Gesserit was against the rules. That's why Paul had to be tested. It turns out Jessica had been instructed to bear only daughters. However, her pride made her think she could have a special baby called the Messiah. After Gaius goes away, Jessica realizes that Paul heard their talk. He accuses the Bene Gesserit of secretly controlling the Imperium's politics. But his mom explains there's more to it. The Bene Gesserit has been working for a long time to bring someone with a powerful mind who can connect the past, the future, and even space and time. They think Paul might be that person, but Paul is unhappy that he's just part of a plan. Eventually, the family packs up and goes to Arrakis. They are greeted by cheers from the Freemen and Paul wonders what they're saying. So Jessica explains they're calling him Messiah in their language. After a long flight over the desert, they make it to the city of Arrakeen, which is protected by a wall from the weather and the sandworms. In his room, Paul learns more about the planet. To avoid attracting sandworms, the Freemen cross the desert using the sand walk, a special walk that mimics the natural sounds of the desert. Suddenly Paul notices a tiny floating machine used by assassins entering through a small hole in the wall. The device flies toward Paul only to stop as they stare at each other. When a servant enters the room, Paul snaps out of it and grabs the device in his hand, crushing it. Afterward, the guards are alerted and they find the assassin dead inside a wall. He'd been cemented into a crevice 6 weeks before and had been waiting for the right time to strike. Meanwhile, a Bene Gesserit sister meets with Baron Harkonnen and Peter to bring a message from the Emperor, who has promised to strengthen Harkonnen's forces with his own elite military force, the Sardaukar. But nobody can know about it. The sister also tells them that they may kill Leto. But Jessica and Paul need to stay safe. Harkonnen promises not to harm them, but when she leaves, the Baron secretly orders Peter to kill the whole family. Later, Leto and his advisors realize that the Harkonnens may have messed with the spice storage. So, they decide to wait for the Judge of Change to inspect it. Right then, Duncan shows up and shares what he learned on his mission. He lived with the Freemen for 4 weeks and found out there are millions of them on Arrakis, including some living underground in tunnels that Harkonnen didn't know about. Duncan also brings Stilgar with him. A leader of a Freeman group, Stilgar meets the Duke. When Leto greets him, Stilgar spits on the ground, which is a sign of respect in his culture. Leto does the same. Stilgar tells them that their people take spice from Arrakis and don't give anything in return. Leto understands the Freemen's suffering and promises that his people won't bother them. Stilgar sees this as an honorable gesture and is about to leave, but Paul asks him to stay. Unfortunately, Stilgar can't stay, but he tells Paul in their language that he recognizes him. Later, Duncan shows them some technology he borrowed from the Freemen, including a paracompass, which can tell direction despite magnetic interference. Sometime later, Leto and his people meet the Judge of Change Kynes, and her attitude almost gets her killed by the guards. She proceeds to inspect the still suits they're wearing to make sure they're in good condition, otherwise they won't survive in the desert. Suddenly Kynes notices the way Paul is wearing his boots in a non-standard fashion and asks who taught him to do it, but he says it just felt like the right way. Then Kynes takes them to see the harvesting fields aboard 3 aircraft. A harvesting crawler is harvesting spice from the surface while a spotter is on the lookout for sand waves that indicate worm activity. The worms travel deep, but they're attracted by noise and vibration. They can't use shields because those attract worms too. At that moment, Leto spots a sand wave and Kynes calls for a carriel to retrieve the crawler. The carriel arrives and lands on the crawler, but a malfunction causes the carriel to fail at picking up the crawler. This means the crawler's crew is in danger, so Leto decides that they will use the 3 aircraft to save them. As soon as the aircraft land near the crawler, Leto tells his men to remove the shield generators to make space. Then, he uses the radio to tell his crew to leave the vehicle and get on the aircraft. The carriel takes off to avoid the approaching sandworm, and Paul is guiding the crew towards the aircraft. But suddenly, he stops and enters a trance. As they are about to take off, they realize Paul is not with them, and the sandworm is getting closer. Paul then kneels down, hears strange words in his head, and starts whispering to himself. Fortunately, Gurney snaps him out of his daze, and together they begin running only to be knocked down as the worm starts to break the surface, causing the sand to sink in. The duo quickly regains their feet and makes it to the aircraft, which flies away as they watch how the sandworm swallows the crawler whole. Back at the base, Leto tells Kynes that she must realize that the Harkonnens left them faulty equipment to ensure that they fail, but she says the carriole was merely old. Afterward, Paul is examined by Yu, who says that Paul seems to be sensitive to spice, but he'll be fine. After Yu leaves, Paul tells Jessica that he didn't have an allergic reaction. Paul has a vision where he sees the desert, a war, and even a kiss with Chaney. He's confused because he thought he saw his own death but didn't. He also reveals that he knows Jessica is pregnant, surprising her because she had just found out. On another planet, Seleucus Secundus, the Sardaukar army is preparing to leave under Peter's watchful eye. Later, in the evening, Yu visits Paul and gives him a drink, which secretly contains a sedative. Shortly after that, something happens. Some guards hear a noise, and then a mysterious person suddenly shoots all of them. This person goes into a room and deactivates the base's protective shields. Leto wakes up and senses that something's not right, so he leaves his room to check it out. He discovers a dead body and tries to call for security, but there's no response. He activates his protective shield and turns the body around, finding a servant with a dagger in her chest. Just then, a poison dart shoots out of the darkness, goes through Leto's shield, and knocks him out. A mysterious figure then appears and reveals their identity as Yue. Soon Gurney is also awakened and learns that the shields are down. He rushes outside to find a large enemy ship hovering in the sky, and he orders his forces to get their own ships off the ground. Explosions begin going off all over the place as the enemy forces bomb the base while anti-aircraft weapons return fire. Enemy transport ships land and disembark soldiers, so Gurney and his men rush to fight them hand to hand. At the main steps, a group of Atreides men is keeping the invaders at bay, but suddenly they're surrounded and annihilated by Sardaukar. Back to Leto, he wakes up but can't move. Yu explains that he's made a deal with the Baron to turn Leto over because the Harkonnens have his wife hostage. After getting Leto's ring for Paul, Yu implants a false tooth in Leto's mouth. If Leto bites down on it, it'll fill the air with poison gas that will kill him. So Leto must choose the right time to kill Baron Harkonnen too. While Robin gathers all the Atreides prisoners to kill them, Duncan sneaks around and kills a bunch of enemies before checking the noble family's rooms, only to find them empty. He immediately runs outside and kills any enemy on his way until he manages to escape in an aircraft. Meanwhile, Paul and Jessica are kidnapped and taken on an aircraft by Harkonnen men. These men talk about doing bad things to Jessica, and when Paul tells them not to harm his mother, they hit him. Ignoring the warnings that Jessica silently gives him, Paul tries using a special power called the Voice on the men, but it doesn't work. The soldiers decide they are deep enough into the desert and plan to leave Paul there. In a desperate moment, Jessica signals to Paul to use the right tone. Focusing, Paul uses the voice again, and this time it works. A soldier then removes Jessica's gag. Allowing Jessica to use her special power, the voice, she compels one of the soldiers to kill the others and set her free. Afterward, she kills that soldier and releases her son, Paul. The aircraft lands in the desert, but their enemies remotely disable it, leaving Paul and Jessica stranded. They can only watch as the city burns in the distance. Later, they discover a survival kit with a note from you. The kit includes a signal for the Atreides. Paul finds his father's ring, and there's a tent. Sometime after that, Leto wakes up and finds himself with Baron Harkonnen. Yu arrives and asks for his wife's release, but the Baron floats over and kills Yu instead. Then Harkonnen tells Leto that his family is dead and that his house has fallen, causing Leto to start whispering. The Baron activates his shield and leans in to hear him better, and Leto bites down on the false tooth to release the poison gas. Several guards die while a few run out and shut the door. Afterward, men in protective suits enter the room and discover the Baron is alive on the ceiling. Back to Duncan, he lands his aircraft and finds Kynes and yells at her for not warning them, but Kynes says she's a judge and must stay neutral. However, Duncan points out that House Atreides was sent to Arrakis to die. There's no middle ground. Out in the desert, Paul and Jessica hide in a tent while an Atreides signal beacon sounds regularly. Paul unintentionally gets some spice and has another vision, seeing Chaney showing him a big battle where he's fighting in a full suit with blue eyes. He becomes upset and tells Jessica that he foresees a holy war spreading across the universe under the Atreides flag. When Jessica tries to comfort him, he gets angry, blaming the Bene Gesserit for making him different. She tries again, and finally, she hugs him, and he reveals that he knows his father is dead. Suddenly, the beacon alerts them of something upcoming, so the duo leaves the tent, which has been covered in sand. At first they think a mouse caused the alarm, but at that moment an aircraft lands with Duncan and Kynes, and Duncan kneels for Paul as he calls him Duke. Eventually they arrive at an old ecological testing station where they can hide from the incoming storm. Paul tells Kynes that the great houses fear precisely what just happened to the Atreides, and only together they stand a chance against the Empire. When he mentions that the Freemen believe in the Messiah, Kynes says this is just superstition. But Paul begins mentioning things about her he shouldn't know and says that he's seen her dream. He also says that as Emperor he could make Arrakis into a paradise. At that moment the enemy finds the station and a battle starts between them and the Freeman guards. Duncan hears the noise and opens the door to find the battle in the hall. So he salutes Paul before going out to join the battle, locking the door behind him. Duncan fights with amazing skill and brings down a few men, but sadly he's outnumbered and eventually falls. Meanwhile Kynes makes Paul and Jessica follow her through a back door. The enemy soldiers fire through the locked door. The three of them have to dodge an attack and run for their lives. Suddenly, Duncan, who was thought to be dead, reappears and fights the soldiers, giving his friends a chance to escape before he ultimately dies. Once they are outside, Kynes advises Paul on how to fly an aircraft through a storm to find the Freemen. However, there's not enough space for her to join them. As Paul and Jessica fly away, Kynes sets up a device called a thumper to attract a sandworm that she plans to ride. Sadly, she is discovered and killed by Sardaukar soldiers, but before she dies, she signals by banging on the ground. The sandworm arrives and swallows them. Meanwhile, their enemies pursue Paul and Jessica, firing missiles at them. Paul takes them into a sandstorm, making the missiles lose track of their aircraft. However, the storm damages the aircraft, so Jessica recites a calming chant, and Paul has a vision telling him to let go of the controls. He follows the vision's guidance, and the storm guides their aircraft. When they exit the storm, the wings break off, and they crash land. Fortunately, they survive, put on special suits, and set out to find the Freemen. When they take a break, Paul has another vision of Chaney, who tells him to face his fears. He also sees another Freeman in the vision who tells him that he has much to learn. Using Duncan's paracompass, Paul and Jessica keep on going, and Paul teaches Jessica the sand walk to avoid attracting worms. Moments later, they accidentally step on drum sand, which makes a noise and gets the attention of a worm. The duo runs away as the creature chases after them, but suddenly, someone activates a thumper that attracts the sandworm's attention away from them. They climb on some nearby rocks for safety and discover they're surrounded by Freemen, who set up the thumper. Stilgar is between them and tells his people not to touch Paul. However, Jamis says the boy looks like a weakling and can't be the Messiah if he needs rescuing. Stilgar explains that Paul is young and could learn their ways, but Jessica is too old and can't come with them. The Freemen immediately attack, but Jessica is a great warrior and captures Stilgar, putting a knife to his throat. The Freemen back off and Jessica lets go of Stilgar, who accepts they both can come. Suddenly Paul hears a voice and discovers that Chani is there, telling him she doesn't believe he's the Messiah. They need to keep moving, but Jamis doesn't want to take the strangers along and challenges Jessica to a fight. Stilgar says that Jamis can't challenge a priestess, so Jamis asks who will fight in her place. Paul volunteers. As they get ready to fight, Paul has a vision of losing and hears a voice saying he must die for the Messiah to emerge. Chani approaches Paul and asks him to die honorably. She lends him a blade made from worm teeth. Then Paul and Jamis begin their fight. Paul quickly gains the upper hand and puts his blade to Jamis's throat, asking him to surrender because he's never killed anyone before. Stilgar explains that surrender is not an option and one of them must die. Jamis fights fiercely, but each time, Paul outmatches him without killing him. Then, a sudden vision takes control of Paul's mind, and Jamis knocks him down. However, Paul begins to accept his destiny and rises to deliver a fatal blow. Afterward, Stilgar acknowledges Paul as one of their own, but Jessica insists that Paul should leave the planet. Paul disagrees, saying his father came to Arrakis not for wealth but for the strength of the Freemen. He believes his path leads into the desert and asks if the Freemen will accept them. The group goes into the desert, and Paul and Jessica see a Freeman riding a sandworm using hooks. Chani tells Paul that this is just the start. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to my channel. Peace out.